Let's now start talking about the profits that firms earn. So let me wait for Anna to come back. Let's talk about the profits firms earn. So Anna, can you describe to me intuitively what you think determines like how much profit a company makes in the market? And anything you think of. What makes what makes a company profitable? Just in an intuitive level. In a competitive environment where there's other firms out there, you know, what would you say is good about a company that's profitable?
When there aren't enough competitors to lower the prices.
Yeah, that's on the right path. Do you want to say something, Sebastian?
How often it is purchased?
How what?
Often.
Yeah, well, so what I was going to say is, so just by definition, profits are the area to the left of the supply curve, right? So the more the firm is producing, the more it's profitable it's going to be. You can just see that because, you know, if here's the supply curve and here's the demand, right? The further I am over here, the more area there's likely to be there, right? So bigger firms tend to make bigger profits. You know, that's one simple principle, right? But it's also the wider range of prices at which they would be willing to produce, the more profits they make. That is, the more efficient they are on average relative to how efficient they are on the margin, the more profits they make. So we can think of profits as being sort of determined by two things: how big you are and how much more efficient it would be for you to produce a small amount than to produce the amount you're producing. But of course, the price itself is determined by other firms' prices as well. So it's everyone's marginal cost that's relevant. So the key thing is how much better you are than other people. So what that says is there are three key determinants of profits: how big you are, how much more efficient you would be producing at a small amount than at producing the amount you are, and how much better you are than other people in the market. One thing that this implies, probably my favorite of these, things, is how much better you were at producing the small amount than you're producing a large amount. What this says is that if you look at someone who's really doing well, who's really succeeding, they're going to be much, much better at doing inframarginal things, at doing less, than they are at doing what they're doing on the margin. And what do we call someone who's like gotten to the point where we're on the margin, doing a little bit more is like much more painful than most of the things they do in their life? We say that they're really stressed out, right? That they're like being taxed to the limit of their endurance, right? So what this says is that in the market, being stressed out is an indication of the fact that you are really doing well. So if you're a really great doctor, everyone's going to want to push you to the point where you're not so productive, right? And so the basic principles of marginal analysis tell us that there should be a correlation between people who feel overworked, who feel stressed, and people who are highly productive, highly successful people. Yeah, or not? What? That's the next slide. Okay. So like, for example, the best restaurants in a city, the ones that are doing them best, are also going to be ones that are totally overworked and can't handle all the custom that they're getting, right? Okay. So a natural question is, why doesn't, as Hernan was saying, the existence of these profits encourage other firms to enter the industry? This is a very classic idea that in the long run, there's people come into the industry, there's free entry, and this competes everyone down to the bottom of their long run average cost curve, and there's no profits. So only short-term advantage allows you to earn profits. So one classic example of this was the California gold rush. Now the people who were in California initially made some money, sure. But within a few months, it was just terrible being in California. Like everyone who went there couldn't even pay the cost of getting there because everyone was trying to get a piece of the gold, right? So anytime someone has profits, someone else is going to try to imitate them. Another example is Groupon, which got out ahead of the thing, but immediately zillions of people were there, and now Groupon like barely managed to make any money in its IPO because it's being deluged with all this competition. If one firm is doing better than another, the other firm will switch to their technology. So, for example, the Apple iPhone was basically the first smartphone that had a touch screen. But now if you get any smartphone, they all have touch screens, right? Because everybody entered and Apple wasn't able to keep them out of the market. On the other hand, anytime a firm is making a loss, it should exit the market. Now, there's a very nice article. Has anyone ever read The Onion? The Onion is a satirical magazine in the United States that had a very nice article on this point. So they said there's this thing called edible arrangements. Has anyone ever seen Edible Arrangements? It's not going to be as funny to you guys if you haven't seen it. But Edible Arrangements is this terrible company that what they do is they make like flower arrangements that you can send to people out of like food. So like out of like little pieces of melon and like strawberries and whatever. You have like a flower made out of this stuff. This is go look it up online. It's the ugliest thing on earth. There's like almost nothing you could imagine being less excited about receiving as a gift than this. Because it's not a flower. It's not a good-looking flower. It doesn't taste good. It's like, rotten fruit. It's just terrible, right? And The Onion wrote this article about the fact that a fundamental challenge to economic theory was the continued existence of edible arrangements. And they had all these interviews with famous economists saying, my whole view of economics has changed because this continues to exist. No one could possibly demand this thing, and yet somehow it remains in business. So that's the theory of the long run, right? So long run supply should, in principle, be flat at the minimum of the average cost curve, where the average cost curve is defined over all possible technologies. And every firm in the industry is really just one chosen technology, and in the end, we should all converge to the minimum of the long run average cost curve where it intersects demand. That's the classical theory of the long run. It's not quite, there's some technicalities about that because there can be integer problems with the numbers of firms, but let's ignore that for the moment. Okay. However, this process of competition can, as Hernan said, be inhibited by policies. So government can intervene or private individuals can exercise violence that can prevent this process of long-run equilibrium being reached. So Tatiana Mora, is Tatiana Mora here? No. Some examples of barriers to entry are licensure. So doctors, taxi drivers, others can have licenses that prevent people from entering. Also, and other types of regulatory barriers or compliance things can stop people from entering an industry. One big source of this that's familiar from Mexico and Colombia is violence. So in many illegal markets, the price of cocaine was actually much higher under Pablo Escobar's control than it was afterwards, because Pablo Escobar's main job was not producing cocaine. It was killing other people who were trying to produce cocaine. So he could keep the prices of cocaine up and his profits up, right? This can also happen just through petty harassment or bigotry, especially for minority-owned businesses in the United States. So in many parts of the United States, there are Asian Americans who run the most efficient, like clothes cleaning shops and things like this, but there can be a lot of harassment of those people from competitors and sometimes boycotts of the non-white owned businesses. Contractual arrangements can also maintain dominance of markets. So there are contractual arrangements by beer producers who own 99% of the market in Peru, which made it impossible for stands on the beaches in Peru to serve Brahma beer, which is a famous beer company from Brazil. These are usually created by lobbying, violence, or by some of these anti-competitive contractual arrangements. And economists tend to call these types of activities rent-seeking. And they view them as primarily harmful. Why? Juan Castillo? Not here?
First of all, because,
Oh, yeah.
because it's inefficient, because people who should be working doing something productive
Yeah.
are working and loving.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and also it reduces the supply, right? So it's a wasteful effort on this. So the worst example of that is probably the Mexican cartels or the Colombian cartels. So Pablo Escobar made a lot of money, but he spent a lot of the money that he made killing other people who might stop him from making that money. That's a total waste of resources and can be very destructive for society, as Colombia found out in the 1980s, right? But also, it just reduces the supply to the market, though maybe for drugs, that's not as important. Okay. However, it's not always the case that the waste, that it's wasteful the way that people try to gain these profits, right? We talked about, we said, look, they're going to use all this violence and whatever, but sometimes the things that they do to try to gain these profits by keeping other people out of the industry can be very beneficial. And this is the reason why we have intellectual property. So intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademarks, prevent people from competing with existing firms, right? And the reason is that we do that is because without this, the competition might actually drive the profits that firms make to zero. But then how would the firms recoup the costs of actually innovating and creating the new product which made the market possible in the first place? So we're going to discuss this problem extensively in lecture 7. But the key thing to notice is that whether barriers to entry are beneficial or harmful is not just an issue, or not even primarily an issue, of driving prices down to cost afterwards. The most important issue, in many ways, is that the incentives that are created by the existence of that barrier to entry. Some cases, that's creating new innovations, making the world better. Sometimes that's killing lots of people and destroying the life of the Colombian people, right? So it matters a huge amount. So when the rents go to drug mafias, it's very bad because it encourages violence. When rents go to academic prestige for creating new ideas, because other people aren't allowed to say that they wrote the same paper as you did, right? And therefore there's a barrier to entry in the industry of reproducing your paper, that's probably a good thing. People don't like any copy of a classic work of art. They like to have an original. That's probably a good thing because it encourages people to be creative, original artists, right? Another example of this, which I think is quite complicated, is that we have strong intellectual property for drugs that help people at the end of their lives, right? That help keep them alive for a few extra days, procedures that are done. Many of those are extremely, extremely expensive both to research and to implement. And yet we have very strong protections for their intellectual property. I'm not sure that that's so great because we're spending so much money on keeping people alive at the very end of their life that it's really subtracting from many other parts of society. And I think the reason we are is that there's this whole guilt relationship where maybe the parent would actually really like to die in a peaceful way, but the child feels that if they don't force them to stay alive longer, they'll be interpreted as not really loving their parents, right? And so they get into this relationship where we spend all this money on the very end of people's lives. Now, if we had a populist policy where we said everyone should have free access, there should be free entry into the production of these goods, there would no longer be any profits from creating them. That would reduce the supply of those and maybe actually be better because there wouldn't be so much money wasted on these activities. So you always have to think, when you think about barriers to entry, what is the activity that's being encouraged by the existence of the barrier to entry? Okay. Now, regardless of whether barriers to entry are good or bad, they're sort of outside of the standard natural market process. And the assumption that we make is that the market left to itself would basically eliminate all the profits that were available. And I want to spend the last half hour of class basically convincing you that that's totally wrong in many, many cases. So this is one of the deepest and most cited economic ideas, and it's quite useful and right in many contexts, like the intellectual property context and others. But the number of cases that this is true in, I think, is much more limited than it might appear at first. So the rest of the lecture will be about talking about the natural limits that exist to the possibility of free entry. And the basic problem is that many activities in life require rare talent, which just is not available to everyone to enter, right? So it's true, if any idiot can implement a technology, then yeah, there's going to be free entry in the absence of barriers. But this is only possible in a very limited set of circumstances. You know, you could say, look, I'd like to freely enter the industry of being Steve Jobs because he's made a lot of profits. Or I'd like to freely enter the industry of being an incredibly talented basketball player. But that just doesn't work, right? I mean, you can't just choose voluntarily at zero cost to become LeBron James. Or I think a lot of people would, right? Many, if not most, talents are scarce. And they therefore command a rent in the marketplace. And this is, in some sense, a barrier to entry. But there's nothing artificial about it, right? It's just the natural scarcity of access to the resources of talent. Free entry requires, or in some sense means, the absence of the need for talent in an activity. So when you hear someone say that there's free entry, what you should interpret them in meaning is that this is something that any idiot is capable of accomplishing, right? Okay, so a key factor for whether any idiot is capable of accomplishing thing is what one means by the relevant industry. So in the long run, it's true. I think the profits off of having, you know, the best touchscreen cell phone are going to be eroded. Apple only has a temporary advantage there. And there's already so much competition that the iPhone is no longer one of their most profitable products. But as soon as it happened, Apple created the App Store. And then they created the iPad. And then they created the next product. So the industry that Apple's in is not really the industry of manufacturing touchscreen cell phones or MP3 players or any other specific thing. It's the industry of always having the next technology, right? And it's, you know, Nokia didn't make so much money because they only specialized in producing the cheapest cell phone. And there was free entry into that industry because it was really easy to copy that. On the other hand, and that happened with a lot of American car companies. The Japanese came in and they did better. You know, they got ahead because it was a really easy thing to copy. Airlines, same thing has happened. People have entered and undercut the costs of the legacy carriers in the United States. But many other industries that are broader are not really defined by the existence of by one particular product. They're created by the constant introduction of new products. So one, what would be some examples, don't look at the slides, of industries that you think might be created that are like the basis of the whole industry is constantly creating new products? Yeah. So what are some examples of companies that you think have succeeded because they're constantly one step ahead? Yeah? What else? Yeah, Google is another great, I mean, Google has like 1,000 different products and they introduce 10 new products every year. And that's how they stay ahead. It's not you know, and there may be free entry into being a better search engine than Google, maybe. Maybe someone can do that. But can someone keep doing the next thing every year? That's a hard thing. That requires a lot of unique talent, right? Intel is all about being ahead on the microprocessors. You know, can you make the same microprocessor that Intel has this year in a year for cheaper than Intel can? Absolutely. But every year their processor speed doubles. So you've got to be better at staying ahead of the curve than they are, right? Microsoft got into a lot of trouble because they weren't so good at staying one step ahead, right? These sorts of innovation machines are a pretty hard thing to copy, right? It's not so easy to just get into the business of having the ability to be beating everyone in innovation every year. You know what I mean? And copying a particular technical process is not enough. It requires some scarce talent, some vision, which is not so easy to come by. Even in a narrow industry, where prices do come down over time in response to demand shocks, this doesn't always happen by new firms entering the industry to compete with the existing firms and get rid of their profits. In fact, it often comes from having one firm create new technologies that allow them to reach even more people. So for example, so in that case, when the long run adjustment happens not by more people crowding into the industry, but by one person cheaply reaching a very large number of people, that creates huge rents for people at the top, even if it leads to a flatter long run average cost curve. And it leads to unemployment for everybody else. So Nancy, what do you think are some examples of that type of thing happening? Yeah, the internet. So like, what's an example of a case where prices came down actually through one person reaching everyone rather than through competition? Anyone else want to give an example? Yeah, McDonald's is a good example. Amazon on the internet is a good example, right? So there's a case where, like, you know, increased demands for goods could stimulate the creation of Amazon, and that could actually lead to more concentration of rents, more monopoly power, rather than lots of people entering the industry, right? Because what Amazon did in response to that demand was to create this new technology which allowed it to dominate the whole production process, right? So the music industry during the baby boom is another perfect case of this, right? There was no real popular music industry, and the radio wasn't really used for playing music before the baby boom in the 50s. And baby boom, big demand for more music. What happened? Were there many more musicians? No. There were actually many fewer musicians, because what happened is they developed this whole radio system of reaching everyone with the best music. And so it concentrated into a few hands all of the value of that. That's a case where the long run adjustment had exactly the opposite of the dynamics that we usually think in economics. Professional sports during the 20th century is another example of that. Rather than more people playing sports, fewer have. And the rents have been concentrated at the top because all the media industries have allowed so many people to be reached by these few best people. Fast food revolution. Gourmet food and celebrity chefs are another example of that. You know, now all the celebrity chefs reach everyone, and there's much more concentration in the restaurant industry. And people are proliferating. Rick Bayless is dominating the Mexican industry in the United States. Gaston Astoria, you know, and Astrid from Peru are reaching all these people. Peruvian food has spread and gotten cheaper not by increasing entry into the Peruvian food market, but by a few people being able to reach a much broader audience. Mass production designs during the 1950s are another great example of that. And I think that that's the future of medicine and education. So my prediction is that my kids won't go to university the way that you guys went to university. And I don't think that I will have a job teaching in a university the way I have teaching in a university in 10 years or 15 years. That's my prediction, because I think that it's an incredibly inefficient technology that we currently have. What you should have is the best people reaching a huge audience through multimedia rather than, and I think the increasing demand for education and medicine is going to make that happen. It's going to overcome the barriers to that. And therefore, the long-run adjustment will happen not through entry, but precisely through the opposite. It will happen through the concentration in a few hands and the ability to reach many more people. This is called the superstar effect, where one individual can reach many, and therefore quality, subtle distinctions of quality become increasingly important. And that says that long-term adjustment, rather than eroding the rents of the people at the top, can actually increase them. So to analyze this, Chad Severson in 2004 took a creative approach. Rather than trying to compare different runs of time, which can be really complicated, he tried to compare different markets. So Gabrielle, I think, left, right? Yeah. So the way that Severson did this was, to say, okay, the superstar effect works through the fact that in the long run we get better communication. So instead, let's try to look at markets where all the things are very concentrated together and transportation costs are really important. Then we should think that in the markets that are really concentrated together, right, there should actually be fewer firms of higher quality if the superstar effect is important, rather than being a greater spread of different firms in an industry. And so let's look at he looks at the concrete industry, where it's very, very hard to transport things further. And he looks at areas that have very concentrated markets, because there's a lot of construction projects in one area, versus areas where things are spread out. And he says, and so he looks at the concrete industry not just because it has these high transport costs, but because it's so easy to measure output in concrete, right? It's just a quantity of concrete and stuff like that. And he finds very strong superstar effects that, as you get more of this long-run adjustment, more communication, more competition, actually what you get is more concentration at the top end of the distribution. And that's what Mark Mellitz finds in his work on international trade as well. As you open up to international trade, it's not like there's free competition and everything gets driven and all the profits go away. In fact, the best people come to dominate the market and drive out the inefficient people. And that effect actually dominates, so you often get more concentrated industries. So here's the example from Severson's data. So he compares markets where there's below median density and above median density. And what he finds is that there's much more concentration at the top end of the productivity. This is productivity distribution in the industries that are more concentrated than where there's more stuff together than in the ones where there are less. Rather than getting, sort of spreading out more competition, you get more concentration in the production at the top. Okay. Furthermore, the basic assumption that in the long run we should get more entry is based on the idea that talent and entry into the industry and the ability to start new companies is a durable thing, that it takes a while to start a new company and get into the industry. But in fact, and for many technologies that might be true. So for example, reverse engineering and setting up imitation, studying to enter a profession, or navigating the regulatory barriers to get into an industry. But there's other cases where this seems unlikely. So for example, a great athlete does require investment of time, but it's not like you can become incredibly talented just by spending a lot of time at it. You have to be born with it. Adaptability and inventive capacity are more important to enter the computer innovation industry than our time to navigate regulatory barriers. And in the internet age, entry has actually become incredibly rapid, like with Groupon. So the notion that it takes time to enter rather than talent to enter is really mistaken. And in fact, sometimes time may actually work against entry, because talent or will to enter an industry might actually be storable. So Oscar Solis is not here, right? Yeah. So some examples of that might be charitable giving. So think about a place that gets hit by a disaster. When there was the big tsunami in Southeast Asia, everyone gave all this money. All these charities got set up, right? There was this huge reaction to that. But think about Africa, which is in an equally devastating condition all the time. So much less money goes to Africa each year than went just in that one year to the tsunami, right? Even though Africa's been in this condition for a long time. Why? Because people get tired of hearing about people suffering in Africa. And people care a lot about a new, vivid disaster in some part of the world. And so the will or talent or interest in starting up a new industry may actually be exhausted if something goes on for too long. The long-run response to African poverty is much, much smaller than was the short-run response to the disasters in many parts of the world. Similar things happen with industry booms. A short-run industry boom can often attract a lot of people into the industry, into the high-tech industry. But a long-run industry boom, people might not really want to spend their whole lives working on that particular topic. They might just want to, experience it quickly. So finance is a great example of that. I think, a short-term boom in finance, a lot of people go in to make a little bit of money. But people don't really want to spend their whole careers there. And so actually the long-run response may well be much smaller than the short-run response. And therefore the rents that accrue to people in finance in the long run might be greater than those that accrue from a short-run boom. Living abroad or, it's developing countries that are really booming. Some people might go live abroad in a place for a short period of time because they want to experience something new, make a little bit of money there, but they might not want to stay there their whole life. And so the long-run response to the boom might actually be smaller than the short-run response. Okay. So I think what this means is that more important than long-run adjustment in many cases is the distribution of talents that are available for an industry. Because this determines the nature of rents, of the long-run responses, et cetera. But it's not the entire distribution that matters, just the people at the very top of the distribution, right? Because those are the people who will choose to select in to that profession. People who are lower down the distribution of talents will choose to go into a different profession. So suppose that some people are very good and others are bad. Then what really matters is what things are like at the very top. Are there a bunch of pretty equally good people at the very top of the distribution? Or the further you get up the distribution of talent, is it increasingly like there are even more people who are better the further you get up, right? So a simple way to formalize this is the notion of the hazard rate. So let's let F be the CDF of the distribution of talent, cumulative distribution function, and let little f be the PDF. What is the definition of the hazard rate? Camilo? Is Camilo Ramirez? Yeah, Camilo. Yeah. Do you know what the definition of the hazard rate is? Do you remember from your statistics class? Anyone else want to give the definition of the hazard rate? Just the definition, the formal definition of the hazard rate. Yes, exactly right. Yeah, so that's called, what's your name again? Carlos. Yeah, so the hazard rate is how many people are there like you divided by how many people are there that are better than you. Right? The PDF over the CDF. So if this is increasing when x is high, then we say that there are thin tails. That means that as you get towards the top of the distribution, there are many more people who are sort of similar to you than there are people who are much better than you. Right? That's what thin tails means. And this is true of any distribution that has an upper bound, like a uniform distribution or anything where there's a highest level. As you get towards that highest level, there's going to be many more people similar to you than people better than you, right? Because that just says that, there's only so good you can be at something, right? On the other hand, when this is decreasing, we say that a distribution has fat tails. And examples of those are Pareto distributions, log normal distributions, and some extreme value distributions. So here's what these distributions look like. So you look at the uniform distribution, this is very thin tails. You get up towards here, and there's many more people like you than people above you, right? Normal distribution is a little bit less, but still, you get to here, and there's many more people like you than people who are better than you. On the other hand, with log normal distribution, as you go up, the number of people versus the number of people who's better than you is pretty constant or maybe even increasing, right? And almost all the data we have about talent in most areas of human life shows that things are extremely fat-tailed. In fact, they usually follow what's called a Pareto law, a power law or Pareto distribution, which is so fat-tailed that I couldn't even really include it. Sorry. You couldn't really put it on here. Oh, sorry. Here's the hazard rates. So the hazard rate for the log normal distribution you see is decreasing, whereas for the uniform, it increases very rapidly, and for the normal, it increases somewhat slower, but still very rapidly, right? So these are thin-tailed, whereas log normal is very thick-tailed. But the Pareto distribution is so fat-tailed that I couldn't even put it on here because its hazard rate was so rapidly decreasing that it would just dwarf everything else on here. OK, so the Pareto distribution has this formula here. Before I describe that, let me just try to give one more intuition for the difference between fat-tailed and thin-tailed. So one way you can think about a thin-tailed distribution is, I don't know if you've ever thought of a skill where you got better and better, and at some point you sort of felt like you mastered it. You felt like, well, I could do a little bit better, but this is about as good as anyone does. Typing is sort of like that. You sort of get the skill, you master it. Driving is sort of like that, right? You get better and better, and at some point the learning curve's over. Now you think about other things which are like professions or parts of life, like economics. I mean, I feel like the better I get at economics, the worse I feel about it. Because I realize, oh shit, no matter how good I get, there's always people who are like so much better than me. And in fact, the better you get, the more you realize how far you are behind the people who are ahead of you. When you're not so good, you're sort of like, yeah, there are people better than me, but most people are not so much better, right? But there are other things, when you get better and better, you start feeling like, oh my God, no matter how high I get, the people who are really good are just, I'm sure everyone's had an experience like that, right? With some sorts of sports, with, I think with academic things, et cetera. That's what a fat-tailed distribution is like. You know that the distribution in an area is fat-tailed if you have that feeling that the better you get, the worse you feel you are relative to the people who are really good. Whereas other things you feel like you master and you've pretty much got down. OK, so a Pareto distribution has this form. The probability that you're below a certain level, the CDF, is 1 minus the level that you're at divided by some minimum level to the negative of some power. Now, this wouldn't fit on the other graphs, and you can't match the mean and variance of this distribution to something because the variance of the distribution actually doesn't exist. So the Pareto distribution has infinite variance. But it behaves roughly like a log normal distribution until you get very high up. But then the Pareto distribution is just so much more fat-tailed than the log normal distribution. So I showed you this log normal distribution, which was its hazard rates were going down gently. This thing is just like massively, massively more. So one way to do that is to take the inverse of the hazard rate. So they're kind of similar until you start getting high, and then the Pareto is just like totally taking off relative to the log normal distribution. OK, so some of the ways that you can think about what a Pareto distribution is like is the following. The fraction that have talent that's greater than twice what you're currently at is 1 over 2 to the alpha times those that are above the talent that you're currently at. So if the Pareto coefficient was 1, you're saying that, you know, if you get to twice as good as you are, still there's half as many people as that are better than you. So it like dies off really slowly, right? If alpha was, you know, 2, then it would be still, there would be a quarter that are twice as good as you. And if it was 4 times, then there would be, you know, 1/16. That's a very slow rate of die-off at the top. Another way of saying this is that the 5th most talented person is 1 over 5 to the 1 over alpha as talented as the 1st most talented person. So the 5th most talented person is 1/5 as good as the most talented person. So that's like way, way down the distribution, right? A particularly common one is alpha equals 1, and this is called Zipf's law. Okay, so Zipf's law applies to many, many distributions in the world. So one of these is the distribution of firm sizes. So if we graph how large firms are on a log scale against how often we see a firm like that, you get a perfect -1 fit, which is pretty amazing. I mean, that's a very, very simple rule. That says that the largest firm is twice as big as the second largest, 3 times as big as the third largest, et cetera, all the way down. And yet, that's exactly the distribution of firm sizes in almost every country, in almost every industry. You see this distribution. And in fact, if you see a distribution of firm sizes that's different than this, imagine that all firms more have like the same share. That's a very good sign that firms are colluding. Because this is sort of naturally what you get in competitive markets because of the distribution of talents of firms. Now, with pay and with incomes, it's not quite as extreme as this. Instead, it's a power law with a 1/3 power usually. So the highest paying CEO makes 1 over 5 to the 3 of the 5th highest paying CEO. But this power law rule still holds almost universally. So my students and you can do this if you come in to my office hours, didn't believe that this was really true so universally. And so they came into my office and I said, give me any profession you want where we know the incomes of the top people in the profession, and I'll do it. And they said golf. So I downloaded the pay of the top golfers and their rank, and you run the regression of the log of their rank against the log of the pay, and you get an R² of 99.7%, and you get some coefficient. So that's incredible. These power law distributions characterize people's talent in an incredibly wide range of settings incredibly well. Income more broadly has alpha somewhere between 1.5 and 3, which means that about 20% of people control about 80% of wealth. This has important implications for revealed comparative advantage across countries. I'll talk about that in a moment. So some of the broader takeaways from this are that talent and other social differences tend to be very large at the very top of the distribution. The idea that you would characterize things by a normal distribution or something with a finite upper bound where you have this free entry thing, maybe that's true some places, but in many, many areas that's totally wrong. It's just opposite of the way that you should be thinking about things. Heterogeneity is crucial, especially at the upper end of the distribution. Those selecting into an industry will be especially heterogeneous, much more than the people who don't select in. And that this simple empirical regularity of using a power law distribution, which is an incredibly convenient thing to work with mathematically, does an astonishingly good job of capturing the basic distribution. So let me give you another example of Zipf's law, which is particularly cool. So this shows you the log of the population of cities, and this shows you the log of the rank of cities in the United States. So this is New York, this is LA, this is Chicago, and so forth on. Look at that fit. It's almost unbelievable. And I bet if you go to your computers and you do it in Colombia, you'll find Bogota is almost exactly twice the population of Medellin, and downward on from there. It also applies to the relative uses of words in almost every language. So the most used word is twice as much as the second most used word, and so forth. So this raises a bunch of questions. It says that rents are really important. It undermines the logic of free entry. It says that some firms are going to be much bigger and therefore may not be price takers. And that the income distribution is going to be highly unequal in its natural state because the most talented people are going to get so much rent, especially in the long term as technologies develop to allow them to reach more people. And these are sort of the issues we're going to be dealing with, the fallout from this very heterogeneous distribution of talents throughout the rest of the course. So thanks.
Professor,
Yeah.
is there any chance to change the dates of the TA sessions?
You have to talk to Miguel about that.
It's just because, it was not like specified on the program before that the sessions were on Saturdays. So,
Miguel surveyed people and did it on the basis of what would be best for people. So I'm just going to let him handle that. I'm sorry. Whatever is good for you guys and for Miguel is good with me.